this is about the Charlotte Harbor area and the interface with Europeans and the Calusa. You know, we don't know as much about the Calusa because there's no remnant people here. There's the folks that are here now, the Indians, are Seminoles and Miccosukee, and they came from up north and came in where there was a vacuum because the Calusa were gone. But that took a long time for that to happen, really. The Calusa in the initial contact were fierce and drove and actually killed Juan Ponce de Leon. We're going into this year of celebration of Ponce de Leon, and the Calusa drove him from their shores and killed him. Which at the time, their hostility and denial were not unreasonable responses to these strangers in these flying boats. Well, about 1540, so if the contact at 1492 came to the Bahamas and then and into the rest of the Caribbean with Columbus, and then started, and so 1513 we had Juan Ponce de Leon identifying Florida, and that's where the name comes, La Florida. But 1521 is when the Calusa drove Juan Ponce de Leon from the west coast of Florida, and he died in Cuba from complications from the arrow that he was stuck with when he was here. Well, so, you know, another 20 years later, we've got some information. In AD 1540, Sinkene, Cacique, or region of the Calusa, one of the last to bear a non-Spanish name, had a son. Sinkene, who had been childless before this, had promised his nephew Felipe that he could be the Cacique when he was old enough. But with the birth of his own son, Sinkene reneged on the promise to his nephew. It was the custom of these folks to pass royal power from father to eldest male child, so Sinkene's son, who was named Carlos, now stood to inherit leadership of the Calusa when he came of age. Felipe was older, had been groomed to rule since he was 6 or 7, and was more popular with the people than his young cousin. The tension created by this family power struggle haunted both cousins all their lives. This is a common theme throughout all kinds of things. This is what happened to the Incas. There was brothers that were vying for each other, and the Calusa and the Spaniards took advantage of that. Well, when Carlos was 10 or 11 years old, an exotic influence came into his world in the person of a boy not much older than himself named Escalante Fontaneda. Fontaneda had been born in 1538 in the new Spanish town of Cartagena in Colombia, South America, and was on his way to Spain for a proper education when his ship sank in the Florida Keys and he was captured by Indians. He was brought with other captives to the main town of Calusa in the southwest Florida coast, where Carlos lived. Though Fontaneda was enslaved and Carlos was for all intents and purposes a royal prince, the two were nonetheless contemporaries and may well have grown up together. When Carlos became Cacique, he still addressed Fontaneda warmly by his first name, called him a good friend, and sought his help in understanding the Spaniards. It was a brief moment of positive transcultural interchange. Later, when whatever familiarity Carlos might have gained from his friend Escalante seemed to have turned to contempt, particularly for Spanish missionaries who came in 1567. The churchmen, led by a priest named Juan Rogel, with little sense of diplomacy or intercultural understanding, set about immediately to dismantle the system of beliefs which had successfully guided the Calusa and their ancestors for centuries. Carlos soon began working to thwart Christianization at every opportunity. A few months before, a Spaniard named Pedro Menendez de Aviles, seeking navigable inland water routes and, incidentally, his own lost son, had come to southwest Florida and met formally with Carlos. Fontaneda was on hand as an interpreter, but the two leaders were bound up in secret agendas and strategies of advantage for their own countries, so much so that no room was left for honest exchange, let alone the benefits of real understanding that an old childhood friendship might have produced. Menendez actually entered into a marriage with Carlos' sister, Antonia, and on this occasion on that occasion, but the match was a political ploy for both sides, and any positive effects it might have had were short-lived. Later, Menendez was back in Spain, and Fontaneda was with him, delivered from captivity, and Antonio was left in Cuba, and Carlos was dead at the hands of the Spanish soldiers. Felipe, who had traded on the old interfamilial animosity and encouraged Carlos's murder, became the cacique then. For the purposes of peace and quiet with the Spaniards, he agreed to allow the Catholic missionaries to work among his people and even promised to become Christian himself. But so abrasively intolerant of Calusa customs and religious tenets were Father Rogel and his men that soon Felipe had no choice but to turn against them, and the Spanish soldiers killed him too. By the end of A.D. 1568, the missionaries and the rest of the Spaniards had been driven from the Calusa capital. Several of Father Rogel's priests were killed soon after. Any chance for long-term, real interpersonal relationships, as represented by the era of Carlos and Fontaneda, relationships of understanding and even friendship between the leaders of the Spaniards and the Calusa, were gone forever. There's more about that, and I'll deal with that some more. But this was Calusa had been dealing with sea level rise. You can see in the mound systems there where the sea level has risen and fallen over the centuries, and they had a very spiritual society. It was brutal yet socially stable, and no more brutal than what it got replaced by, and arguably less so. Well, now let's listen to Still Friends, Go Easy on Me.